Copyright notice. You are free to download and copy this work in audio format for replay in any audio or video mode, and I encourage you to do so and enjoy and learn. You may redistribute it in a non-commercial fashion, that is, not for profit directly or indirectly. You may not sell or seek to profit from this publication in part or in whole, nor may you translate it into any written format for any purpose. Thank you. Chapter 23 of the Enovel survival novel, When the Walls Came Tumbling Down, as read by the author. Sparks. The old metal office chair squeaked a bit as David leaned forward to fine-tune the frequency. Right hand clutching the pencil, paper pad on the desk, he began to write down the Morse code as he received it. The sender was transmitting via code to save on power, but it also gave the transmission an incredible range. This report was coming from the other side of the globe, Australia. The sender gave a brief yet startling report of the situation down under after sending his identification numbers, which David dutifully recorded at the top of the pad. The first word of the message sent a chill down his spine. Tuberculosis. Then other details followed. Epidemic. Disaster. The sender reported in brief terms that without medicines, this once somewhat contained disease had now spread. The first rumors of deaths and diseases being spread via dead bodies were not entirely true. The body of a person killed by trauma does not spread disease as the body decomposes, although the smell is horrible. The bodies of those who themselves die of an infectious disease, however, do, especially if these bacteria make their way into drinking water or people come in contact with it. In addition to this, dysentery and cholera from untreated or improperly treated waste were taking a heavy toll. Illnesses that used to be so easily treated were now nearly impossible without people being educated on the subject, without people having some basic medicine, even just simple antibiotics. David remembered how some health organizations in the world used to speak of this, how easily the developed countries could have eliminated almost every disease in the entire world, and especially in the undeveloped parts, with such a small expense compared to the later cost of treatment. Now, those diseases which had been allowed to survive were coming back with a vengeance and were present in the States, including North America. Leprosy in the South, he had heard just yesterday, and it had been confirmed. The U.S. government CDC, or Center for Disease Control, had a shell presence in the fractional government that still remained, and it was publishing very abbreviated reports, which David thought was pretty responsible and a departure from other agencies in the past. If they did not know for certain, they would not say, was the new policy. Thus, they were tracking the incidence of it, but not the total numbers affected by these diseases. They were giving simple warnings to avoid contact with strangers, to boil water before drinking, to wash hands, and other simple precautions that seemed so easy and yet he knew could become fatal. He laughed when he thought of the eccentric Howard Hughes, who was a known germaphobe, and realized he was becoming the same. This report from Australia ended as the sender gave his identification numbers, and then the signal was gone. David hardly noticed as Linda came up behind him, touched his shoulder, and brought him a cup of hot tea. Tea, he thought. They were out. "Dear, where did you get this?" he said, and Linda smiled and said, "It's herbal. The garden is starting to come up now." David wrinkled his nose in mock disdain, raised an eyebrow suspiciously, and said jokingly, "Herbal? Are you one of those hippies, Linda?" Busted, she laughed and crooned, "Don't you want somebody to love?" and swayed a bit, then stopped when she realized he probably had no idea what she was talking about. David swiveled back to his radio to power down and added, "Don't you need somebody to love?" Then turned back to face her, and together they sang, "Wouldn't you love somebody to love?" And they laughed. "Well, David, you are full of surprises." And with that she smiled and headed back to her room. Her footsteps as she walked down the hall warmed his heart, light, delicate, but now so much more lively. David was happy to see her this way. The man Kevin had been coming around a lot, and it didn't take a rocket scientist to see why. Linda was a pretty young woman, and if he were 30 years younger, he'd give Kevin a run for his money. He knew also they would need a place to live, those two, because this sort of thing was going to end up in marriage as sure as the snow would come next December. He had already figured that out too. It would be the perfect symbiotic relationship for the three. He would let them live there. He had plenty of land, after all, to grow the food they needed, and in exchange for the house and the land, they would take care of him perhaps into his old age. He feared being alone now, not just for the physical problems associated with age, but also for the psychological ones. Now that he had Linda around the house, he realized how much he had sequestered and isolated himself, how much he liked hearing noise, the happy noise of hearing dishes clanking in the sink that told him he was not alone any longer. Stealth. Moving carefully through the compound, John Casolo needed to get to the servants' area and try to blend in. He thought of where to go, who to trust. The maid he had coerced to sleep with him was definitely not a good choice. Perhaps his butler. He went to the man's small little bungalow immediately and would make him a very lucrative offer inside. Knocking loudly, Johnson spoke through the door back. "Who is it?" And Casolo laughed a bit to himself. If he were one of these looters, he certainly wouldn't be knocking. "It's me, Mr. Casolo," he said almost apologetically, then added, "It's John. Please, open up." There was a pause, and his face turned crimson red. How dare this man delay? Then he realized that things would have to be different now, at least for a while. "Yes," the man said, and John noted two things. First, the man did not say "sir" or address him as Mr. Casolo. Second, the man was making eye contact and appeared almost haughty. John had negotiated many times in his life. He knew full well the value of deception and would need to use those skills now. Later, when the compound was returned to his control by whomever the senator would send, he would deal with this disloyalty severely. "May I come in?" he began. Then, "Please." The word "please" sounded empty, flat, and hollow, and both men stood there as it came out of his mouth and fell to the floor. Johnson opened the door a bit and motioned with his head for him to enter. After he stepped in, the man looked up and down the street quickly before closing the door swiftly. Johnson walked past him and down to the tiny living room. A good sign. He had not only let him in, but was taking him into the living area. He was remembering now who was in charge. The human mind clings to fears and pleasures, and John knew the man's mind must be balancing both right now. He would hopefully realize that the situation they were in was temporary, and that when it changed, John would reward him, or at least promise to do so. John knew how to play that game very well. So many people were such brown-nosers to the rich, and that was something he and his friends used to their advantage time and time again. People didn't really like them after all, and they knew it, but pretended not to know this. People liked their money, though, and only wanted to get some of it. They viewed their friendship in terms of what they could get. John and his friends used to take small wagers on who could lead someone on the furthest before they realized the friendship had no payday in it. In one business affair he had entered into when he lived on the coast, the man had a small pool company, and John had gotten him to put the pool in his estate at below cost, which must have set the man back his entire year's profit. He had done this like he always did. First, you tell them you're unhappy with the current business relationship you have, and that you're looking for someone else as a replacement to handle all of these contracts. Then you throw out some huge amount of money. He was good at figuring out how much a man would sell himself for. He had done it for decades. When you hit the man's selling point, he would stop using common sense and gamble. He would abandon principles too. Everyone had a price. Once you know the sellout point, it's easy. Give me what I want for free or below cost, and I will make it up to you later. The make it up part was essentially that. It was made up, a fabrication, a ruse. John didn't feel badly about it, though. That was life. He was doing such people a favor. They were being taught how business really operates. It's dog eat dog. John lowered his head a bit in fake humility. "Thank you so much, Johnson," he began, trying his best to seem genuine. Johnson wasn't buying it, but he proceeded anyway. Outside, a gunshot made him jump, and he realized the precarious situation he was in. Johnson was smirking at him, too, because both men knew exactly who held all the cards at the moment. It was time to pull the ace out of his sleeve, though. "Let me pay you the compliment of being blunt, Johnson. I need you to protect me, and I will reward you handsomely for this. Name your price, and if it is within reason, it's yours." He looked carefully at the man's face and his eyes. The waver in his eyes told him he was thinking about it. He continued, "I just need you to hide me, to tell them I live here with you, that I am a technician." Johnson folded his arms over his chest, but also did not change his foot position. Good. The man was going to bargain, going to also require some sort of emotional acquiescence on his part, some humility. He would fake that too. "Johnson, I am so sorry for the way I mistreated you at times," he began, and Johnson quickly interjected. "At times, Mr. Casolo? At times?" He looked at the floor, even though his face was turning red in anger. "You are right, but please, hear me out." When he looked up, he could see the man was listening. £200 in gold, he said, looking Johnson directly in the eye. "That is how much I will give you if you guarantee me you will protect me." The man's eyebrows lifted, and he knew he had him, knew he had won, knew they had a deal. He stuck out his hand, and Johnson looked down at it, and then up at him with a smirk. "Okay, but I want to be paid now." John walked past him to the couch and sat down, then said, "Now you know I can't do that, Johnson. We have to wait until the government sends troops to recapture this place." Then he put his feet up on the coffee table, more to make a point than anything else. "Get me a drink, will you, Johnson? Then, I know you stole some of my scotch. You people are always stealing from your employers, aren't you now?" He added the last, not certain, but based on his suspicions that everyone was crooked. Johnson could not believe this man's nerve, his unmitigated gall, and stood looking at him for a moment. Casolo reached into the cigar box by the table and pulled one out, recognized it as one of his own. As he unwrapped it, he raised an eyebrow and said, "Well, let's go, Johnson. I'm thirsty." Fuming and mumbling under his breath, Johnson stormed to the kitchen to fix this man a drink. The man had to be the most arrogant person he had ever met in his life. If he didn't come through, though, he would pay this man back in spades. In spades. An imposition. The cool air coming through the window helped a little to ease the heat that radiated up through the seat. The Humvee commander's chair had 2 batteries below, adding a certain credence to the phrase, "the hot seat," which is exactly what Ox felt like he was in at the moment. That he was in way over his head now was obvious to Mitchell at least, and certainly to himself. Still, he would bluff his way through as he always did. Outside, the world looked normal as they drove along, when in fact it was not. Still, this was not the first time the world had suffered setbacks, and he thought of the plague, the Spanish Inquisition, the Crusades. Those may not have been worldwide, but to those who were caught up in these events, they must have seemed that way. Shamron had been messing with the radios lately and had picked up some transmissions from the official government, but they were garbled and distorted for the most part. This was good and also alarming when the Ox realized that if things got restored back to normal, he would officially be a wanted man, a felon. Now, however, in his new world, he was just as anonymous as the next guy, or so he figured. He thought of that damned woman, Maria, and how much trouble she was. He didn't know what she was angling for, but only that she had a lot of people cutting him looks whenever he got around the speed bumps, the augmentees, the volunteers. Mitchell took him aside and told him to ease up on his freaking hobbies a bit. He didn't like that Mitchell was now talking down to him. It would make it harder for him to cut a good deal when he handed the show over later. His mind was too cluttered, though. He was too tired to deal with it all right now. The convoy was moving up through the town of Washburn now and was making good time. Usually when people saw the military vehicles, they would either hide or children and old people would stand and wave, but then look puzzled when the buses with bicycles and junk hanging all over them rolled through. Although painted green, the things hanging on the outside and the generally sloppy way civilians do things made them look like a gypsy traveling circus and not a military convoy at all. Mitchell had said they were only a few miles away from the lager where they would set up and conduct rehearsals for the attack on the town. He didn't want to do this part either, but they needed the supplies, and who knows, it might even be as good a place as Saint-Quentin or better. Eternal. The soil felt cool to the touch of her bare feet and hands despite the heat of the sun on her face, and she relished the honest smell of the newly turned earth. The tray beside her full of onion sets, Rachel planted them carefully 6 inches apart, following the string line her uncle had set. Each onion would produce its own bunch, and these had been forced or raised from seed in the force house, a sort of greenhouse that Caleb had set up, which was warmed by rotting cow manure. The memories of her ordeal seemed to pass more each day, especially since that strong young man had come to town. She knew she was in love with him and was not afraid. Perhaps she had realized him into too much, but then she knew the qualities she saw were real, honest, and to her quite necessary. Martha looked over at the girl working and recognized that faraway, wistful look in her niece's eyes. She knew how, and more importantly why, she seemed to be so smitten by him, and so early. After what she had been through, she would need to feel protected again, especially if she wanted to love and have a happy marriage. It was therefore only natural that she be smitten by a man so capable of protection. Although their ways did not embrace wars or violence, they also understood that they were part of the world around them, the world they chose to come out of and be separate from. She wondered if the soldier would convert to their ways, and decided probably he would not, at least not right away. She also had a very strong sense they would see the tall soldier again, and that right soon too. She didn't need a premonition or a sign for this. The look in the man's eyes when he left told the tale. Face down. The neighbors had come when they heard the shooting. They said that hearing several shots fired in a row told them there was trouble. They saw to the woman and told me they would bury the man. His name was Ricky. Greg would be buried too, in an unmarked grave face down, and his name would be forgotten. I wondered if Greg's mother knew when she gave birth to him that he would stop being a human being at some point in his life and become an animal, become a disease. The man had left a swath of destruction and death in his path. He had murdered, raped, stolen, and anything else to get what he wanted and cared nothing for his victims. A true sociopath. I had hesitated to kill him because of my own moral reservations, a desire to not be on the same level as him. In so doing, I had allowed another good man to be killed, another woman to be raped by this filth. Some believe that civilization always advances, that it always moves forward and progresses. I knew enough of history to know that this was not accurate. Technology advances almost always because it is not constrained by a morality, by a virtue. It is a necessity, a tool, an implement. Culture, on the other hand, is a reflection of the norms, the mores, and values of a given society. These are driven by people's sense of virtue, pride, motivation, religious appeal, ideals, and other values. Our culture, indeed, much of the world, had become lazy and took things for granted. The fact that the economies were controlled by a handful of aristocrats whose insatiable greed and lust for power had driven us all over the brink only underscored and aggravated this condition. Most people knew nothing of how the world or society around them operated and were content to believe lies and fairy tales fed to them, things that tickled their ears and not things that challenged them to act, to correct, or repair. In essence, the world felt it was always somebody else's job to fix things and to do things. Parents pawned their children off on the public schools while they chased the almighty dollar and wondered later why their children grew up to be so messed up. People thought it was the government's job to fix everything that didn't run right. Clever politicians promised it would do just that, if only you would elect them and their party, of course. Thus, the people of the world had essentially allowed their government to become a giant paper tiger, and on the day of infamy, it had folded and fallen flat. Jacqueline and I left. There was nothing we could really do here further, and we had our own places to be, to take care of, which was understood readily by all. Together with Maggie trotting along beside, we began the walk back home. I hoped we would be within range soon of radio, so I could call in for pickup. My leg was swelling and hurt like the devil. The Roost. Standing atop the ATV near the main route north astride the highway, Bill brushed at the flies that buzzed incessantly around him before putting the field glasses to his eyes again. He was carefully studying the terrain now. The key to the defense would be to make the enemy engage on the defender's terms, and not vice versa. Bill needed to keep those crew-served weapons out of the fight, and since he had no heavy weapons to defeat their armor, he would draw their fire to some elaborate dummies and fakes. Everyone, in fact, was working on these false defensive positions now, and Bill was observing to make sure they would be just obvious enough to draw the enemy's fire, so they would engage these targets and not the actual defenders. Bill's plan was a bold one. They would maneuver simultaneously 2 squads of the reserve platoon around the flanks of the vehicles up to some high ground and try to fire down with designated marksmen into the vehicles and take out the turret gunners. This force would also incur some casualties, and this part he tried not to think too much on. The main platoon would have to defend a line that stretched nearly a mile, far too much territory to set them into a static defense, although there were really only 3 actual avenues of advance that would lead to the fire station, which was just on the other side of the river, and all these would have to cross at one of the 3 bridges. Bill was not counting on the enemy being stupid, though, on bunching up his force. He knew they would maneuver their forces tactically up to the bridges on a wide front in order to secure the approaches and also engage the defenses and suppress them while their vehicles took the bridges. The bridges currently had zigzag barriers set up on them, made of stacks of logs, and a single tractor could push these down and block the bridges for hours. They did not want to demolish the bridges, though. They were essential for travel and traffic, and it would have split the town in half. Bill also needed the bridges open in case his people got overrun and had to fall back, which was an eventuality he had to consider. He needed intel, though, and hoped his scouts would come back with a good report. A good report would be one saying that the enemy was small and disorganized. Bill had a strong suspicion, though, that this was not going to be the case. Visitors. Even with the windows open and a nice breeze, Clarence was sweating profusely and delirious with fever. Joshua and Rosemary were tending the young soldier, and it was not looking good. His skin was hot. He was sweating and flush. She feared the worst and knew they might lose him still. He was tough, but not that tough. Nobody was. If the wound was septic, they would need to get him back to the doc. But he had explained already the shortage of adequate medicine, including antibiotics. If only they had antibiotics to give him. Suddenly, in a flash, she remembered something. "I'll be right back," she said, and rushed out the door, bounding down the stairs of Leroy's front porch and off to a neighbor. Arthur had raised goats once, but had sold them just a year ago. He might have what they needed. She rushed up to the front door and banged loudly, and Art shuffled up, looked through the glass, and opened the door. He was in his bathrobe and slippers. "Do you still have that goat medicine?" she said hurriedly. Arthur stood there a minute, and she pushed past him. "No time to waste, dearie. Where is it? Give." Art followed her back to the utility room, and there was a large red first aid kit with "Vet Kit" written on the side. She grabbed it, put it on the floor, opened it, and fished around. There inside was a vial of ampicillin, a bag of tetramycin crystals, and a jar of amoxicillin 250 milligram tablets, all clearly labeled for veterinary use only. "I need these, Art," she smiled and said. He said, "What's up, Rose? You raising goats now?" She grabbed some of the syringes and then said, "Oh, heck," and threw it all back in the box, closed it up, and said, "I need all of it for now, dear. I'll be back the rest later." With that, she rushed back and gave Clarence a shot of goat antibiotics. She knew it was a gamble, but what else could they do? What did they have to lose? He was certainly going to die from his wounds anyway. As she was putting the medicine away, she and Joshua heard the sound of diesel engines rumbling into town. Josh grabbed his rifle and helmet and headed for the door, but she grabbed his arm and said, "Wait, dear, don't go out there. Look through the window instead, here." Together they watched as 2 Humvees, followed by over a half-dozen buses, rolled through town, followed by more Humvees. The Humvees looked military, and Josh recognized them. It was that damned fraud first sergeant and the traitors who had murdered those men that day, and God knows what else they had done since. Rose could see that something was wrong, and she asked him what had happened. Hurriedly, he explained how their patrol was being led by a first sergeant, who it turns out was not a first sergeant, or so he suspected. The patrol was supposed to do atmospherics, to check on civilians and make sure everything was okay. Instead, it had gotten ugly, and the first sergeant had tried to drag a woman inside the house to assault her after shooting her husband. They had been ambushed by a lone gunman, who they had shot as well, and the whole thing had caused Josh to wake up and realize the man was an imposter. He and his men had been put on foot, and the rest of the story she knew already. Josh began to put 2 and 2 together. The man now apparently had a larger force of people, and they were civilians. They were definitely up to no good. That much was certain to him, but what? They were headed north. He would get with Leroy when he returned. This man was nothing but trouble, and the town had to be prepared. But how? And with what? Josh dug the rest of his uniform out of his rucksack, changed into a fresh t-shirt, and shaved his face. He was still a soldier, and a soldier should be the one that deals with this man, this imposter and his crew. He had no idea how, but only that he had to. Cross country. The cool morning air almost burned a little in her lungs as she and Robert picked up their pace a bit, cresting the long, rolling hill. They had just run around the log roadblock and were headed toward Claremont Farm. They had been running partners for the past 2 years and had run in several marathons during that time. Bill had asked them if they would run by the local farms and if they saw some Army vehicles to take video but not get caught. They had run this route before many times. It was nearly 12 miles and they were up to it. The camera was in Robbie's camelback pouch and had extra batteries with it too, as well as video cards. They had covered nearly half the farms in the area already and had seen nothing. They would hit 5 more farms and then head back. Their pace was steady and smooth, and it was a beautiful morning. It was hard to imagine the world was in chaos. Robbie saw them first, several buses and a truck with a gun on it. He told her that it was a machine gun on a Humvee, so they ran up to the high hill above the field. There were a lot of people walking around and doing things purposefully, but they had no idea what they were doing. They had people that were guarding or watching around the edges, and one of them was watching them intently, almost angrily, and so they kept running to another place. There was a secret spot that they knew of. They used to play there when they were children, and it had a large maple tree that they knew how to climb. She suggested that, and Robbie agreed. To get there, they scrambled through the brush in their shorts, which scratched their legs, but they didn't stop. It wasn't so bad. Robbie helped her up to the first branch, then with his strong hands he scrambled up behind her. Soon they were up in a high limb and could clearly see the panorama below. They saw 8 buses and 6 of the Humvees in a large circle. In the middle, people were scrambling around doing things. Most of them seemed to be doing something, and only a handful were guarding the outside, one manning each of the machine guns of each truck as well. She reached into Bobby's camelback and got out the camera and pretended to nearly drop it just to see the reaction on his face. Priceless, she thought. His eyes were big like saucers. She giggled and handed him the camera. "Here, you stalker, you probably know how to use this." And he just gave her a look before he leaned against the trunk of the tree to stabilize himself and began filming. He turned the camera off and on several times, changing the memory card out, and also saved several files, and also took a lot of pictures too. He didn't know what he was taking pictures of, so he zoomed in on things and took a lot more film than he needed to. After an hour, Robbie said they needed to go. He was always so paranoid and nervous, but maybe this time he was right. They climbed down, walked back to the road, warmed up a little, and then did a slower shuttle run back to find Bill. He had said to bring the film directly to him and to be careful not to get caught. Janissaries. The helos made it to the airport in Presque in short time, but the cargo helicopter was having serious trouble and landed hard. The pilot reported that there was major damage to the main rear rotor and a Class 4 hydraulic fluid leak. The Loach touched down nimbly, though. It was intact and had taken no fire at all. The men in the bird, including the aircrew, were all unharmed, which did not surprise Tim much because ground fire at aircraft was usually inaccurate unless those doing the shooting were very well trained. It was just bad luck that it clipped the wings off one of their birds. Now they were stuck, stranded here at this airport that was obviously as abandoned as it was picked over and looted. While his men sorted themselves out from the flight and unloaded the helicopter, the pilots looked over their birds. Tim walked around and looked things over at the airport. Everywhere things had been looted. He noted a lot of vehicles around the airport that all seemed abandoned. Apparently, many people had driven here and flown out, but then looters had come and stolen everything. He guessed that before the crash, they had driven there while the roads were still plowed. In one of the hangars, he found a large dump truck with a gas engine. It had a plow on the front. The gas caps were off the large, heavy tanks on either side, indicating it had been siphoned, but an idea began to formulate in his mind. This has been Chapter 23 of the e-novel, survival novel, The Walls Came Tumbling Down, as read by the author. Tune in next Friday for Chapter 24.